Namaskar. Hello and welcome to Yosanas Foundation's webinar on Israel's foreign policy and diplomacy. First of all, let me announce that it's a great day for us because we finished 1 year of our existence, and today in the beginning we are going to release our annual report, for which I'll request Ambassador Anil Trigunayat to release the report. And I welcome all the participants and the eminent panelists. So I'll just say that, I mean, this journey began last year during the Corona lockdown. It was not something very planned and not something like very expected that this would, I mean, the organization would continue and organization would reach these heights. I mean, it just started as a sort of a webinar series, but then later we came out with the website and we started publishing articles. We got amazing support from our participants and from good guidance and enlightening views from our board of advisors. And it was a wonderful journey, let me say. With that, I'll request Ambassador Trigunayat to just join and say something and release our report. Before that, I think, Rushali, can you just share the screen? I mean, with the report. Rushali, Lavanya?
Yes, Lavanya will be
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Lavanya, go ahead.
Sir, is it visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Yes,
Yes,
that's
yeah.
right. Well, thank you, Abhinav, and esteemed advisors and governing council members, panelists, and dear friends who have joined us today for this. It is indeed an honor for me really to release the annual report of the Foundation. I must compliment you, Abhinav, and the whole team for this exceptional commitment that has led to several events and interactions organized by the think tank and with high quality research articles that were published by you and other research scholars, policymakers, and associates. During this period, you have vastly expanded the network of thinkers in the strategic domain and that have policymakers. My congratulations. I was struck by your comment in your message in the report that the weakest link on the ground leads to the passage of faulty narratives and a flawed understanding of national security at the topmost level, which in turn results in bad policy decisions, worse implementation, and worst outcomes. So very well said, and so true indeed. Today we are witnessing a highly volatile, worried, and COVID-ridden world as the Cold War 2.0 is beginning to threaten each one of us in our own domains. Future strategic calculations, in my view, will have to be in digital space, and we shall have to gear up for it. As we meet, several events are happening. In the Middle East, as the discussion today pertains to Israel, new and younger leaderships have come to the scene, be it in Israel, Oman, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE, later known Algeria and Sudan and Libya and Lebanon. A resurgent China is testing the patience, while Turkey is testing many people, many countries' resolve. Russia is trying to find its locus standi as a big power, as EU is straddling between the East and the West and across the Atlantic, as they have launched the B3W against the Chinese BRI. Of its whole, which is not being tempered, now being tempered under the orders of President Xi Jinping himself. Whether it is a wolf and the lamb's clothing, it needs to be seen. Afghanistan and Yemen and Syria and Libya will present greater challenges in times to come as we cope up with the after effects of the COVID, man-made or otherwise. Multilateralism is at its lowest point today. Economic revival will depend how we cope up with the vaccine equity and how well we fight the third and fourth waves. Hence, what we see is an upheaval across the spectrum. And wading through it might be a much harder challenge this time around. On the regional front, as you know, a SCO meeting is being held in Dushanbe with NSAs from several countries are participating, where Afghanistan would be a major agenda. We don't know if Indian and Pakistani NSAs will meet and talk about and be able to break the ice further. China, after amassing its forces and weapons and illegally entering into our territory over a year ago, is blaming India for the tensions, as if we shall not defend ourselves. External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, while he's speaking yesterday at the Doha Economic Forum, reiterated that even written commitments taken by China are not being adhered to. And then how do we trust them? Business as usual is out of question. Whether we build this important relationship on mutual sensitivity, mutual respect, or mutual interests, more than equally depends on China. Today, we are going to listen and discuss various dimensions of the Israel's foreign policy. Bilaterally, we are on a firm ground. What happens in West Asia has a direct implications on our own security. We hope to learn if our panelists see the light at the end of the tunnel with regard to Palestinian issue, and what kind of a solution does Tel Aviv prefer or envisage, since the violent and unpredictable situation is untenable and cannot add to the security of the Israeli people. Hence, I extend once again a very warm welcome to the esteemed panelists and all the guests who are attending, and wish the USANA's Foundation and its CEO, Mr. Abhinav Pandya, more profound achievements and greater success. It's been a great pleasure being a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for a wonderful message and very comprehensively laying out the emerging global geopolitical situation and the complications involved in that. Indeed, we are living in a very dicey and a very volatile world. And as like coming from the think tank community, it's certainly our duty to come out with solutions, come out with the out of the box thinking which can contribute to the world peace. With this, sir, CD Sahai, sir, sir, your guidance has also helped us, amazingly. Would you like to say something?
Thanks, Abhinav. In fact, as usual, there is nothing much to add on the global strategic scenario as it is building, and the conflict areas as are emerging. And we find ourselves almost right at the center of everything. Whichever way we look, our own region is a very troubled region, and it has been so. But I agree with you that Ambassador Tribhunath has summed up the emerging scenario so beautifully and so succinctly. Almost all the challenges that the strategic community, the think tank community are facing, are likely to face greater intensity in the days to come. I also joined Ambassador Tribhunath, and now formally I've made a few comments before everyone joined in. But those were my personal comments. But I extend to you and your young team of scholars and researchers who have done wonderful work in this 1 year, 25, 30 seminars, hundreds of more than 120 or 125 write-ups, and it's amazing. Not only the productivity, but the volume of reports published and issues analyzed, but the manner in which the very forthright and very not aggressive, but very fact of the matter way you have explored them and laid it before them for policy makers to come to a conclusion, and particularly your work on radicalization in Kashmir and the region and terrorism, remarkable achievement. I compliment you all, and also join all other your well-wishers in wishing you another successful year and many more to come. Keep it up. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Heartfelt thanks to you for the wonderful guidance and for giving your blessings to the organization. Krishan Verma sir has also joined, and he is also the member of our advisory board. Sir, would you like to share some thoughts?
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
No, very little left to say actually with those excellent introductory remarks which Ambassador Tiknath has made, and of course Mr. Sai has, in his usual way, very comprehensively covered all that was left and added a little bit to it. What I have to just say is to once again acknowledge the fact that in just about a year's time, the amount of reports, the seminars, some very interesting, extremely insightful, and spelled correctly as INSIGHT, if you will, rather than insightful in the other sense, have been, I think, a great contribution to the strategic community, and I'm sure to people who are actually formulating policy, the inputs are really very well worth considering. It's been a pleasure to be associated as an advisory council member with the think tank. I think having been located away from Delhi has actually given you the freedom to be able to articulate views which are a little different from what we keep coming out from here. Of course, there's a lot of scholarship which resides in Delhi. I will not ever belittle that. But it's always nice to hear people from outside Delhi talking about this and actually trying to reach out to a very important section of the populace, which is the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, where there is a lot of scholarship which is developing and interest developing in international relations. And I think, as Mr. Sai has rightly pointed out, I think your work, especially on the radicalization aspect, Afghanistan, a couple of the ones on Tibet, the neighboring countries, Indo-Pacific, I think these were really excellent programs. All I have to say now is that please keep up the great work, and let me also use this opportunity to congratulate your team, which has done some excellent coordination work, excellent research work. The quality of your product has certainly been something which I have personally appreciate, and I'm sure a lot of us who have been in the business for a long time would also similarly share our views. So all the very best, Abhinav, and your team. Carry on the great work, and we are always on the sidelines with anything that we could help and contribute with, any kind of help and that we could give. I have certainly been a little remiss in not being able to write as much as I would have liked to for you, but always available to speak on certain subjects as you wish choose. So all the best to you and everybody else in the team. Go ahead, have a great year ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your writings and to have you more on our discussions and panels. So just before I start introducing today's panelists, I would just like to mention that the reason why we started this organization in this Udaipur, it's a small city, because this city has a great history of strategy, war, and diplomacy. Maharana Pratap, India's one of the bravest fighter and a warrior, belonged to this area, and he comes from the Mewar royal family. And he led a great fight against the mighty Mughal king Akbar. Battle of Haldi Ghati was fought here. He had very bare minimum resources, but he didn't surrender. He did not accept the suzerainty of the mighty Mughal king. And finally, in the Battle of Diver, they inflicted a massive defeat to the mighty Mughal forces. So that's why this place has a great history of nurturing independence, free thoughts, and valor. So I'm really proud and honored to come from this city and having started this organization here. So now I'll just introduce our today's panelists. I mean, the theme of today's webinar. With Israel, we have, over the last 5 to 6 decades, we have moved from dislike to a secret love relationship, and finally to an open marriage with Israel. Okay. It started in 1960s when India-Israel began unofficial channels of communication, and finally then in 1992, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao officially recognized Israel, and the diplomatic missions were set up in both the countries. In the Kargil war, Israel was a great help to India. And finally, after the advent of Prime Minister Modi into the power, we finally embraced Israel, and the relationship has progressed beyond with leaps and bounds over the last 5 to 7 years. It's a counterterrorism partnership expanding into other domains like agriculture, technology, industry, various areas. But somewhere we feel that, the awareness about Israel's history, foreign policy is not much. I mean, people love Israel for its heroic struggle in counterterrorism. But I guess in India, since we are looking for a very long and stable partnership, we need to increase the awareness, enhance public awareness and interest in the Israeli affairs. So today we have eminent panelists with us, which I'll be introducing. But before that, I would like to welcome Shriji Arvind Singh Ji Mewar, who is the Royal King of Udaipur, comes from the Mewar royal family. And this is the family which has, which has given birth to Maharana Pratap and great fighters, who fought the war of Haldigati, fought the war of Diver. Sir, Shriji, sir, I will welcome you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Shriji has been a great academician and a great enthusiastic supporter of international affairs, and has a keen interest in intellectual diplomatic initiatives and efforts. Thank you very much, sir, once again. It's an honor today that you have joined. Okay. So now I'll introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Emmanuel Navon with us today. He is a lecturer with Tel Aviv University and a senior fellow with the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and the Khaled Policy Forum. Then we have Dr. Sarah Masha Feinberg, foreign policy and a security advisor. She is also a lecturer with Tel Aviv University and visiting professor at School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. Then we have Ms. Nina Slama. She is a guest lecturer and teaching assistant at IDC Herzliya, the eminent security think tank of Israel. So I'll just begin with Dr. Emmanuel Navon first. Dr. Navon, please come and share your thoughts. And I'll request all the participants to mute themselves when the main speaker is speaking. This is just for the bandwidth issue. Okay? And after the participants finish their lecture, we'll have a question and answer session. Okay. Dr. Navon, yes.
Thank you very much for hosting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here as a big believer in the relation between Israel and India. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to discuss the relation between our two nations. Allow me also to dedicate this session to the memory of my colleague and friend, Professor Aaron Kleiman, a well-known expert on Israeli foreign policy, who unfortunately passed away this past Friday. And he very much inspired my work on Israeli diplomacy. He was the author of dozens of books on Israel's foreign policy and other topics of international relations. He very much helped me also improve my own book, which I'm sure you've heard about. My book that came out recently on Israel's foreign policy, The Star and the Scepter, a diplomatic history of Israel, published with the Jewish Publication Society and the University of Nebraska Press, which is the most comprehensive book to date on Israel's foreign policy, but also provides a historical framework and perspective on the diplomatic history of the Jewish people. Now, when I was to talk to this session today, Nina asked me to insist on the aspect of Israel's strategy of the periphery and put it into its historical context. Because, as you know, besides the welcome improvement of relations between Israel and India in the past 2 decades, which you already mentioned, Israel's international standing basically has never been so good. Despite the unsolved conflict with the Palestinians, Israel's international standing has improved dramatically in recent years. And as you know, that includes also the normalization with a few Arab countries, such as the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, but also Morocco, Somalia, and other countries are on their way. So I think in order to understand this improvement of Israel's international standing, I think it's important to kind of rewind our diplomatic history when Israel was actually very isolated in the late 1950s. Back then, in the late 50s, Israel's only international ally, military and diplomatic ally, was in fact France. But that diplomatic and military relation was showing early signs of its limits and of its end with the return of de Gaulle to power in 1958, and also even more so with the end of the war in Algeria, which was the ultimate reason for this alliance between France and Israel. And at the time, Israel did not have yet a strategic relation with the United States. The foreign policy of the US at the time, under the Eisenhower administration, was precisely to try and woo the Arab states and try to convince them not to drop the Western influence and not to establish alliances with the Soviet Union. And therefore, the US under the Eisenhower administration was keeping its distances from Israel as much as possible. So Israel in the late 50s found itself into a diplomatic dead end, which is why our prime minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, decided to think out of the box and initiate a policy which he called the policy of the periphery, which consisted in establishing alliances with countries in the wider Middle East with which Israel had common interests and common enemies. Israel, of course, had a conflict then with the Arab world and also with the Soviet Union, and therefore it upgraded its relations with countries in the wider Middle East that were also in conflict with the Soviet Union and the Arab world, and those countries were mostly Iran, Turkey, as well as Ethiopia, and also minorities such as the Kurds in northern Iraq, the Christians in South Sudan, and the Maronites in Lebanon. And this strategy actually worked out pretty well, because indeed Israel in the 60s established very close relations with those countries. Iran, in fact, before, of course, the Islamic Revolution of 1979, was a very close ally of Israel. It was our main supplier of oil, and Israel and Iran had close military relation. Iran, of course, was very concerned by the Soviet threat in the Middle East, and it had this historical conflict with the Arab world and with Iraq. And therefore, Ben-Gurion's strategy of the periphery, if you like, was based on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Same thing with Turkey. Turkey is also a non-Arab country in the Middle East. I'm talking, of course, about the Turkey of the 1960s, way before the current Islamic regime of Erdogan. At the time, Turkey was a secular republic, very much opposed to Soviet influence, and very much resentful of the Arab world because of the role of Arab leaders in dismantling the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. And Turkey, of course, already back then was a member of NATO. And basically, Turkey and Israel cooperated in order to oppose Soviet influence and the Arab nationalism promoted by Egyptian President Nasser. In fact, Israel, Turkey, and Iran even established a trilateral intelligence agency to fight Soviet influence and Arab nationalism. The alliance also included Ethiopia, a mostly Christian country with a conflict with Muslim neighbors such as Eritrea and Sudan. There was also the historical link between Israel and the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, who considered himself a descendant of King Solomon. And so this strategy worked pretty well throughout the 1960s until the mid-1970s. First of all, Ethiopia got lost because of the pro-Marxist revolution rebellion in 1974, so it was no longer an ally of Israel. And then, of course, even more so, the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. So from an ally, Iran became basically an enemy. But even with Turkey, Turkey also was eventually lost, even though Israel and Turkey did upgrade their relations in the 1990s for many reasons related to the end of the Cold War. Eventually, with the ascent of Erdogan as the leader of Turkey, first in 2002, turning Turkey into a kind of an Islamic Sunni republic with a very hostile foreign policy towards the West and towards Israel. So eventually all those countries of Israel's periphery were lost, if you like. And yet the very concept of the periphery is not only still relevant, but has gained a new impetus in recent years. And why is that? Well, because precisely because Israel and Turkey and Iran have basically become, I wouldn't say in the case of Iran, definitely an enemy country. In the case of Turkey, a regional foe. This has created new alliances around Israel vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis Turkey. When it comes to Iran, I mean, of course, the Sunni Arab states of the Gulf, precisely because those countries consider Iran as a threat because of its nuclear program. They consider Israel as their most reliable ally in the Middle East in order to face Iran. And this explains this normalization between Israel and the Arab Sunni states in recent years. With regard to Turkey, precisely because Turkey has become a major threat to the East Mediterranean, Israel has upgraded its relation with countries such as Cyprus and Greece, countries that did not have good relations with Israel in the past, but also Israel has upgraded its relation with other regional allies such as Azerbaijan against Iran. And therefore, what we have today is kind of a new periphery, but kind of also a reversal of the old periphery. If in the 1960s it was a periphery together with Turkey and Iran against the Arab world, today it's basically the opposite. Today we have this de facto alliance with the Arab world, or part of the Arab world, against Iran, and an alliance with Greece and Cyprus against Turkey. But another reason for this rapprochement and for this new periphery, and this will be my last point, is also the energy aspect. I mean, of course, the Sunni Arab states have normalized the relation with Israel mostly because of the Iranian nuclear threat, and Greece and Cyprus have upgraded their relation with Israel mostly because of Erdogan's neo-Ottoman imperialism. But there's another reason for this rapprochement, and that is energy. Don't forget that the prices of oil have been declining for the past 10 years, and this tendency will continue. The oil countries, the rentier economies of the Gulf, know very well that their economic model is not sustainable. And they admit it openly. The leaders of the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia admit openly that in order for their economy to be sustainable, they need technological innovation, and therefore they need Israel, which is the hub of technological innovation in the Middle East. And when it comes to our new alliance with Greece and Cyprus, here also the energy factor plays a very important role, and that is, of course, the fact that since 2010, Israel has become a major player in the field of natural gas. Cyprus also has very significant natural gas resources, and together Cyprus and Israel have become a major player in the field of energy. And therefore, you have this project of building a huge pipeline between Israel, Cyprus, and the European Union, which is very much opposed by Turkey. So as you can see, this complete reshaping of Israel's regional alliances is not only due to geopolitics, but also to energy factors, to major changes in the energy market. And to conclude, I would say that Israel's regional periphery strategy has basically been turned upside down. As I said, if in the 1960s it was a periphery together with Iran and Turkey against the Arab world, today it is basically a periphery with part of the Arab world and also other allies such as Azerbaijan and Greece against Iran and against Turkey. So I think this is an aspect of Israel's foreign policy which is often overlooked and not always very known, but I think it basically helps to explain the achievements and successes of Israel's foreign policy in recent years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nevan. Thank you very much for giving us such a wonderful historical background and the nuances of Israel's evolution of foreign policy. I will come back to you with many interesting questions, but before that, I would like to invite Dr. Sarah Masha Feinberg to just share her thoughts on the topic. Dr. Sarah.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible,
Yes.
Dr. Sarah. Yes, yes.
So, namaskar. Thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking in front of this eminent assembly. In a way, our discussion today about Israel foreign policy and decision-making at the Usanas Foundation is a testimony to the empowerment of our two nations, one big India and one very small Israel, that were born approximately at the same time in recent history, and that know very, very well what privilege it is to be able to speak about one's own foreign policy and decision-making. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I would like to explore with you an old and yet a new question of Israeli foreign policy, maneuvering, and decision-making, that is the Russian question. How does Israel, which has become over the years the staunchest ally of the United States in the Middle East, approach the Russian question, both in the global arena and in the regional Middle Eastern arena? Which policies did Israel adopt vis-à-vis Russia? And what is the rationale behind Israeli moves and Israeli decisions? Let's not forget that Russia, or the Soviet Union, to follow up on Dr. Nevan's points, is an old question. In fact, the Soviet Union was the first country on earth to grant de jure recognition to the young Jewish state, while the United States granted initially a de facto recognition under President Truman. Let's not forget that in the first 40 years of its short existence, the state of Israel had to grapple militarily and diplomatically with the Soviet Union, confronting the Soviets directly in the war of attrition when the Soviet Union supported financially, militarily, intelligence-wise, Israel's paramount enemies from Egypt to Syria or Iraq or the Palestinian National Movement. But today, as we speak, we are 30 years, almost year by year, to the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Russia and Israel, and Russia stands apart as a new question in Israel's diplomatic thinking and decision-making. For Israel, why is Russia a new question? It is due, in my assessment, to four major and critical developments of the post-Cold War era. The first element is the global US-Russia confrontation. As we speak, the US and Russia relations have reached the lowest point since 1991. And the question for the Israeli MFA or MOD is, does Israel belong to the West? And should we join the US-EU overtly confrontational and coercive policy vis-à-vis Russia? You know, Russia is defined by the US as the biggest threat of the US national security interests. And if Israel doesn't join the West, doesn't join this overtly confrontational approach when it comes to Russia, which price should Israel pay? And which price is Israel willing to pay? I would like to open a parenthesis when we speak about Israeli diplomacy. Israeli diplomatic decision-making is most and foremost determined or defined by the security establishment thinking. And when it comes to Russia, there is a weight of the Ministry of Defense and of other security bodies in determining the right diplomatic move vis-à-vis Russia. The second development is the gradual and yet consistent withdrawal of the US presence from the Middle Eastern arena and from the Middle East at large, especially from Afghanistan. And just this week, the Biden administration has started to withdraw its air defense capabilities from key Arab Sunni countries and mostly from Saudi Arabia, mainly Patriot anti-missile batteries. Whether this move is targeting Russia and China in other theaters of operation, whether it is related to the renewal of the nuclear talk and the decision of the United States to reach a new deal with Iran, the fact of the matter is that Israel needs to confront this vanishing presence of the US on the Middle Eastern arena that goes hand in hand with the strengthening of the Russian and Chinese presence, both diplomatic, military, and energy economic presence across the Middle East. The third element is Russia's deepening geopolitical stronghold across the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and North Africa. Russia has come back, it's a cliche, but under President Putin, to the Middle East with the view of restoring its ground power status, overcome its defeated power complex, reach international dividends in the global arena, especially in Eastern Europe, secure its military presence in the Eastern Mediterranean and up to Yemen. As we speak, Russia is considering opening a new base, a military base in Yemen, and further its economic interests in the energy, nuclear, and military industrial sectors. And the fourth and critical element is, of course, Russian military intervention in the Syrian front lines that officially started in September 2015. De facto, Russia established, consolidates, and continues to expand its military foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. It currently enjoys a situation that the Tsars didn't have and the Soviet Union didn't have, meaning enjoying two military bases in Syria, one in the Syrian port of Tartus, a naval base, and the second one, the air base of Khmeimim in the nearby province of Latakia. And of course, the implication for Israel is that Russia has become a military power on Israel's northern border, on Israel's most explosive and most critical border. And the understanding from an Israeli side and the Russian side is that basically in this situation and under these circumstances, each party, Israel and Russia, has the capacity of harming the other party's plans, strategy or operational plans, or complicating the designs of the other. So each party needs to reach some kind of tolerance, some kind of turning the eyes to the other party's game in Syria. So given this multi-layered global and regional changing context, and as I speak from an Israeli perspective, Is Russia our friend? Is Russia an ally? Is Russia a partner? Is Russia an enemy? Is Russia a foe, an adversary? Or is Russia, as some Western analysts phrase it, a frenemy? And if Russia is a frenemy, when should it be befriended? And when should it be deterred or coerced? And furthermore, seen from Jerusalem, is Russian consolidating presence in the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and in Syria a challenge or an opportunity? So in fact, Israel's foreign policy vis-à-vis Russia is based on a built-in dichotomy or built-in paradox. At the bilateral level, the ties between Israel and Russia are just thriving. And this is based on an intense peoples-to-peoples contacts. Israel is home to 1.5 million Russian-speaking population, and those relations flourish in a variety of domains, from trade to cultural relations or common collective memory projects. Yet, from a regional perspective, Israel and Russia grapple with almost irreversible disagreements on issues that each side see as critical to its own national security interests or power projection needs. These issues, of course, are Iran, nuclear ballistic regional, Syria, and the Palestinian question. So at the regional level, Israel and Russia walk on a very tight rope. They are like two tango dancers that dance over a ravine. They can fall at every moment, and this relationship is marked by crisis, contradictions, ruptures, reconciliation, and lack clear visibility and predictability. So when it comes to Russia, what is the Israeli perspective? First, the official Israeli discourse is that we have one and only one strategic ally, and this is the United States. Neither Russia nor China will replace this position. And yet, Russia is not an enemy. Russia is part of Israel's foreign policy design to ever widen its diplomatic outreach of Israel from the Arab Peninsula to Brazil and India, and of course, Russia. Number two, Russia is part of former Prime Minister Netanyahu's grand design of expanding and deepening Israel's relations with the world's global powers, meaning Russia, India, Brazil, and other powers. This idea of really anchoring Israel in the concert of the big nations. Three, Russia has become a very, very significant diplomatic player in the Middle East through its multi-vectorial and multifaceted strategy. The wisdom of Russia is to act in a non-Soviet, non-Cold War way. Russia is not ideological in its approach. It's coldly pragmatic, and it has developed ties with almost all the major actors of the Middle East. Yes, it has a privileged relation with Iran and the Shiite Crescent, but at the same time, and most recently, it has developed intimate relations and very close relations with the United States allies in the region, from Egypt to Jordan, from the Gulf nation to Israel. So Israel for Russia is part of this big multi-vectorial, very pragmatic approach to the Middle East, as Russia sees itself as a mediator between the Israeli and the Arabs, the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Sunnis and the Shiites, the Christians and the Muslims as this honest broker, mediator, and actually Russia seeks to gain political dividends by acting as a mediator between those countries. And actually think about it. Russia is the one and only stakeholder in the Middle East that can easily speak Farsi to the Iranians and Hebrew to the Israelis. And up until now, they have done it very, very skillfully and in a very, very sophisticated way. They've been able to maintain close relations with Tehran and Jerusalem in a way that should a third Lebanon war erupt or third Northern war erupt on the Lebanese and Syrian and Iraqi fronts, Russia would be the only power to be able to mitigate, to act as a back channel communication between Hezbollah and Israel. And this is a position that Israel values, that Russia seeks to sell all the time. Up until now, it has been unable to do so, but this option is on the table. The fourth main asset from an Israeli point of view is, and which is central and vital, is that Russia is a military power on our border. And actually, Israel, through its Mabam strategy, Mabam is the Israeli strategy consisting of containing the entrenchment of Iran in Syria and in Lebanon at a sub-war threshold and level, meaning carrying out airstrikes that limit and contain Iran's entrenchment in both countries. Given this strategy, Russia, from an Israeli perspective, represents in a way an opportunity. It could have represented a major challenge because Russia is the ally of Iran in Syria, is an ally of the Syrian regime, has saved the defunct, almost defunct Bashar al-Assad regime, and Russia has established an anti-access area denial bubble, A2AD, in Syria. And basically, Russia had the capacity of complicating or limiting the Israeli airstrike in Syria. But Israel did understand that when it comes to Syria, Iran and Russia don't see eye to eye. Iran has the ambition of expanding its military stronghold and demographic power in Syria, while Russia's approach is all about balancing and containing the power of each and every stakeholder involved in Syria in order to keep its military and economic assets in Syria. So in a way, the tacit deal between Russia and Israel is to allow Israel to conduct its airstrikes in Syria, turning a blind eye, and for Russia enjoying the effect of Israeli airstrikes in Syria that contribute to limit Iran's influence in the future of Syria. So there is a tacit agreement between Israel and Russia. How old it's going to hold, just God knows. But there is a tacit agreement whereby each party pursues its own interests vis-à-vis Iran in Syria. And up until now, it has worked through the establishment of a de-escalation or deconfliction mechanism between Russia and Israel. They've established it based on the model existing between the US and Russia in Syria, and it has worked pretty well. It has worked on two channels of communication. The first channel was between President Putin and Prime Minister Netanyahu. This was the highest level of dialogue between the two countries. And the second channel, the back channel, was the military to military channel which has worked extremely well with crises and ruptures, but over time it has worked extremely well. So basically what we're seeing in the southwestern part of Syria and the northern eastern border of Israel, in the area of Deraa and Quneitra, we've seen massive Israeli strikes that were tolerated by the Russian forces over there. Similarly, we've seen in the Deir ez-Zor area in the eastern part of Syria, where Iran is trying to strengthen its presence, massive Israeli strikes that were also tolerated by Russian forces underground. And here the point I would like to make is that Russia's approach to Syria and to the Middle East at large is much more practical than what Western analysts tend to say. Namely, one of the reasons why Russia entered the Syrian front lines was also a way to become an indispensable stakeholder for Saudi Arabia. One of the main goals of Russia in the Middle East is to become a significant actor for Saudi Arabia, with which it has entered very intense negotiation regarding the regulation or the stabilization of oil prices, which is a critical part for Russia. So you see that from this point of view, Israel and Russia do pursue a common interest in Syria, which is to curb the Russian influence. But this alignment of sorts comes with a price. And this price can be very, very heavy. And here I enter a larger discussion about Israeli foreign policy and decision-making, which is the tension between realpolitik and even cynicism at all price, and maintaining a certain level of ethics and keeping Israel in the camp of the Western nations. Although Israel has a strong interest in non-entering an overt confrontation with Russia, in order to keep its interest in Syria, as I've mentioned, it has tried maybe too hard to stay on the right side of the Kremlin. We've seen it by, Prime Minister Netanyahu being almost the only Western leader, attending the military parade on the Red Square in May 2018, during the ceremony marking the 73rd anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. We've seen it when Israel refused to condemn Crimean annexation in March 2014 at the UN General Assembly, while the United States explicitly requested from Israel to do so. We've seen it when, Israel abandoned Georgia and Ukraine at times of crisis. We're seeing it, in the US perception, the US view of Russia-Israel relations. The US has had numerous questions over the nature of this relationship. This being said, the US is happy to use this relationship when needed as a back channel communication between the US and Russia. And also, Israel has remained extremely vulnerable to Russian attacks or toxicity in the region. Russia may change the rules of the game entirely in Syria overnight. Russia's rearming of the Syrian regime, training of the Hezbollah, and deployment of offensive and defensive capabilities that fall into the hands of Israel's enemies in Lebanon and Syria and other places is not advancing Israel's interests. And there is also the threat of cyber disruption, cyber threats, as the Shin Bet director Nadav Argeman acknowledged that Israel is, yes, a target of potential Russian attacks at times of elections. And you know that we love to have many elections in Israel. So as a conclusion, I would say that the development of Russian-Israel relations is first of all maybe a testimony of the empowerment of Israel. You know, if we take a longue durée approach, we do remember that Jews in the Tsarist empire, the first thing they wanted to avoid was to be recruited into the army of the Tsar. And here suddenly you have Russian-speaking Israeli soldiers negotiating with Russian soldiers in Syria at an equal level. And this is an image of resilience and maybe of triumph of Israeli sovereignty. But the last point that I want to make is that for all its faults and I would say ethical problematic dimension, I would say that the Israeli model of keeping a very practical channel of communication with Russia, of maintaining some kind of minimal dialogue, even at times of crisis, is certainly a model that could inform the US, the European and the Western approach in general with Russia, meaning minimizing a certain degree of confrontational approach, but maintaining a deterrence and, if needed, a coercion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah. There's something from your lecture. It was absolutely amazing and stunning to learn about the Russia's, covert or back channel role in the Middle East. And I guess, same goes for the Russia's role vis-a-vis the China. West can, certainly they can leverage Russia's ties with China for all the back channel communications, provided they are able to minimize the confrontation. Okay. I will come back to you with more interesting questions, but before that, I would like to invite Ms. Nina Slama to come and share her thoughts on the topic, and if she can focus on India-Israel ties, that'll be amazing. Nina, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Abhinav. I want to thank you and Usanas Foundation for having us today. And we can see that this panel is another example of how deep and close the relations between both countries are. So to begin with, I would like to say that the relations between India and Israel were not so good at the beginning. Israel always wanted to have good relations with India since its inception in 1948. But India was reluctant to do so because of domestic, regional, and international considerations. On the domestic level, India didn't want to alienate its Muslim community. It was afraid that if it will be closer to Israel, the Muslim community will feel that it will get far away from the Arab world and the Muslim world, and India didn't want to disunite its community, especially after partition. On the regional level, India didn't want to alienate the Arab countries because it was afraid that the Arab countries will eventually side with Pakistan on the issue of Kashmir. And India wanted to have these good relations with the Arab world. On the international level, we can say that India was the leader of the non-aligned movement. It didn't want to side with Russia nor with the United States. And as Israel was an ally of the United States, it didn't want to have any relations or anything to do with the US. So in general, it decided for more than 4 decades not to have relations with the Jewish state. It was only in 1992, when former Prime Minister Narasimha Rao came to power, that he was able to establish these relations with Israel. because the entire international arena changed. There was a transformation of the international system. There was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which enabled India to change, to transform its own foreign policy, not only towards Israel, but also towards the West. It wanted very much to be closer to the United States. And the way to do so was to establish good relations with Israel. It is true that the relations were established in 1992, but they became more strategic under former Prime Minister Atal Biari Vashpai, who saw in Israel not a real ally and a friend not only in need, but also in deed. And we can see that when both Pakistan and India launched their nuclear experiment, the entire international community boycotted India. And the only country who was willing to help India militarily against its war, the Kargil war against Pakistan, was Israel. And it was not the only time that Israel came and assisted India in its wars, but it was also during the wars. It was against China in 1962, and it was against Pakistan in 1965 and 1971, when there were no relations between the countries. So Vashpai wanted to establish a strategic triangle between Israel, the United States, and India in its war against terrorism, especially after the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York. And when former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh came to power, there was a fear in Israel that maybe there will be a kind of deterioration between the countries. But the opposite was the opposite occurred, because during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the relations extended, and it didn't only fulfill agreements which were signed during Prime Minister Vashpai tenure, but also signed other agreements with Israel. It is true that when Prime Minister Modi came to power, we could see that the relations not only became better and strategic, but also very close and personal between former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi. When Prime Minister Modi came to power for his first administration in 2014, Prime Minister Netanyahu called him and congratulated him over the phone for his political achievement. It was not only over the phone, but also posted on social media, and both leaders were communicating together over the phone and on social media to express their support for each other and their good relations between not only their relation between the leaders, but also between both nations. So they were wishing good wishes during Jewish holidays and Indian festivals, and it was very interesting to see how close and deep the relations, not only between both leaders, but also between the countries, became extended. Earlier, Dr. Navon was talking about a new periphery strategy and the normalization of relations between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. And I believe that these relations and these normalizations between these countries will not only lead to good relations between these countries, but also will upgrade the relations with India, as India has good relations with both Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. These countries share common opportunities and threats. And I believe that this will be another opportunity to extend the relations between all these partners. Now, with a new government in Israel and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett coming to power, we can see that both Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett were already discussing and wishing goodwill to each other. And I believe that it doesn't matter who will be in power in both countries. The relations will continue to grow and extend in multiple domains. It will be not limited only to the military domain, but also to agriculture, innovation, water management, culture, academic, and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you. Okay. So now we'll have questions. Okay, I'll just begin with this question. Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Let me begin with what Jasmine Mehta has asked. Jasmine's question: why is the United States so indispensable in Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, and what is its role? Who would like to take the question? Dr. Sarah, you?
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Yes, perfect.
Yes. So basically, there are many actors trying to enter the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation track. You have the Europeans, you have the Russians, you've had the Arab League, and of course the United States. What is interesting is that over the past years, each stakeholder, like the European Union and Russia and other Arab countries, used that track, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, as a way to advance their own interests. For example, in the case of Russia in particular, advancing this peace process was a way for Russia to restore its ground power status, or to find a way or a platform of communication with the West in times of crisis. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process was a consensual issue between the Europeans and the Russians, for example. In the case of the United States, Israel will only accept, and I speak under the authority of Dr. Navon and of Ms. Nina Slama, will only accept the authority of the United States to conduct this kind of negotiations. Why? Because they do require very, very painful and very difficult compromises, both political and security-wise, on the part of Israel that need a guarantee from the United States. So I would say that any peace initiative coming from the European Union or Russia or China from the very beginning cannot be considered from an Israeli perspective as a serious peace initiative, because it doesn't come with guarantees. In the case of Russia, an advantage, a comparative advantage of Russia compared to the United States, is that Russia, during the Cold War, has developed very deep and intimate relations with the Palestinian leadership. And Russia enjoys a very close relationship with the Palestinian Authority and with Hamas in Gaza. And Russia has worked in the past years, in the past 5 years, quite intensively to promote an intra-Palestinian reconciliation. And Russia always wanted to put on the table of a future negotiation this topic of a PA, Palestinian Authority, and Hamas reconciliation. And it would have been a major triumph. And of course, it does serve Israeli interests and American interests. Also, a point that I want to add is that during the Abraham Accords, the negotiations, one of the big issue was that the Abraham Accords did not include the Palestinian question. It was about designing a Pax Americana in the Middle East, a Pax Americana without the Palestinian question. And in a way, from one point of view, it worked quite well. But we've seen from the last round of conflict in Israel that it created a big backlash. And I am personally very aware of the development of the security situation in the West Bank and in Gaza because of this disjuncture between the Pax Americana plan in the Middle East and the Palestinian question. With the Biden administration, they seem to come back to this question and to include this question. But as I've said, there is a withdrawal of the US, and I don't see the US embarking on a plan that is bound to fail. This is the problem of the Palestinian question, that there is a built-in failure in the beginning, and I don't see any party wanting to promote any kind of a peace agreement.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have our next question from Nitin Narayanan. So the question is, what has been the impact of BDS and how has the Israeli establishment dealt with this? Also, hypothetically, would a non-violent Palestinian movement be more difficult to deal with internationally?
Maybe Nina or Dr. Navon?
Okay, I will take this question. Concerning, it is true that Israel has to do a lot of efforts, not only on the military aspect of its conflict with the Palestinian, but also in the media and its way of explaining why it should act as the act in the Palestinian front. So it is true that the BDS and other organizations who are criticizing, which are criticizing Israel, are challenging Israel in its effort to portray himself as a country which is a country who's having a just which is having a just war against another Palestinian, but we are not in a war with the Palestinian people. And Hamas and the PLO are trying to portray it as we are an aggressive actor who tries to make the life of the Palestinians miserable. But this is Hamas, which make the life untenable for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. It is true that we have some kind of cooperation with the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, but in Gaza there is no partner with which we can discuss with and can normalize our relations with. They have been very aggressive, very violent, not only verbally, but also militarily. And this is true that Israel is very challenged, not only by these movements who are criticizing Israel, but also by these terrorist groups who, which does not, we don't want to have any negotiations and any way to solve this conflict with the Palestinians, unfortunately, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina. We have our next question from Samira. Considering the recent developments in on the Israeli-Palestinian front, do you think the progress in the diplomatic ties with the Muslim countries is at risk? I mean, are the Arab-Abraham Accords going to have a future, or we have come to some kind of a halt due to the recent Israeli-Palestinian standoff? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, Nina, who would like to
Yes.
take the question? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, at the rhetorical level, the countries that have joined the Abraham Accords have condemned Israel for this latest round of violence, but their condemnation was quite mild, and they haven't undertaken any measure that would challenge the substance of the agreement, of the accords up to now. So meaning that from their point of view, there is a priority of the Abraham Accords agreement with all the package that they mean security-wise, technologically wise, economically wise, before the long-lived Palestinian question. So this is in terms of their attitude during the latest round of conflict. Basically, the Palestinian Authority is accusing the countries of the Abraham Accords to have abandoned the Palestinian question, for the American or Zionist enemy. Regarding the resilience of the Abraham Accords, I do have questions that are related to the cooling off of relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia. You know that the Biden administration, from the very beginning, has signaled its willingness to temper or slow down the rhythm of relations between Washington and Riyadh. They've signaled their willingness to cut off their relations with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, dealing only with the King of Saudi Arabia. They've related it, they've linked it to the murder of Saudi journalist Kargoushi. But basically, we are seeing, in addition to the withdrawing of air defense capabilities from Saudi Arabia, that will be carried out until late July, meaning in late July, Saudi Arabia will be deprived of most US air defense capabilities. We are seeing a cooling off of relations. What it means that those countries will be tempted to enter a new kind of negotiation with Iran. They will tempted to reach some kind of modus vivendi of agreement with Iran because of the weakening of American presence in the region. In addition to this, imagine in late August or September, the Biden administration is signing a new JCPOA agreement, an upgraded agreement with Iran. By this time, my question is, what will be the value and the resilience of the Abraham Accords that were built as a security architecture confronting Iran? So there are a lot of questions surrounding these triumphant accords, and unfortunately, from an Israeli perspective, they're not guaranteed forever.
Thank you. I guess
Nina, Slama, maybe you want to add something to this analysis, or no?
No, I believe that also the Arab Spring changed the total approach of the Arab states towards Israel. They don't see it as a threat, but as a solution to their challenges that they are confronting especially on the economic stage. We can see it with the Abraham Accords now, and other countries in the world are pushing aside the Palestinian question, in my humble opinion, in order to strengthen their relations with Israel.
Thank you, Nina and Dr. Sarah. So I have two questions for you, Dr. Sarah. You mentioned about Russia's role, especially in the back channel talks in the Middle East. But I guess we are kind of, we are not missing the elephant in the room. We are not talking about China, which is likely to, and which is actually emerging as a very, very potent actor in the Middle East. And as since being an Indian, we are very accustomed to the Chinese ways of sabotaging and making penetrations. They're not very overt, but they're through business, they're through tie-ups with various organizations. And so far, I see that China has been supporting Israel's enemies. Okay? Be it with Iran. China recently signed a $400 billion deal with Iran. And even the recent standoff with the Hamas, China's stand was, I wouldn't call it supportive of Israel. It was more supportive of the Hamas. So how do you look at that? This is my first question. And second question is, Afghanistan is becoming the center of all the anti-Israeli actors. You know, Iran is majorly emerging in Afghanistan with its proxies in the Taliban organization. Turkey, with its dreaded Sadat organization, has come up as a very strong actor in Afghanistan. And Pakistan, as we know, the founder and the mother of all ills related to terrorism, is certainly a big actor. Again, China is a very big actor. So don't you think that Israel should now, find some space, a strategic space in Afghanistan, ward of its future threats? Yeah.
Well, thank you for your great comments. Regarding China, it is true that now in the Middle East, the big competition of the global power competition is between Russia and China. And China's approach is different from Russia's approach in that way that it is built to endure. China is using the Middle East as a roadmap for its One Belt, One Road initiative, building infrastructure, reconstructing Syria, developing Syrian gas and oil resources, building ports in Israel, for example, in Haifa, building a military base in Djibouti, being involved in Yemen with the Gulf states all over. So China, from a very discreet actor, is slowly and slowly building up its capabilities. And the crucial moment will be when China will convert its economic power into military, political, and diplomatic power. In addition to this, we've seen that China is becoming more and more involved diplomatically. China has a 4-point initiative, peace initiative for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. China was very vocal during the last round of conflict. And of course, China is doing all this to also challenge the US influence in the area. The US is extremely, extremely concerned by Chinese presence in the area and is pushing Israel to disengage from China. Israel is receiving an extraordinary amount of pressure to really disengage from China and containing Chinese presence in Israel. For China, the main point I want to make is that with Israel, the relationship is also dichotomic, as it is with Russia. At the bilateral level, the relationship is excellent. Chinese and Israeli economic relations are extremely good. Israel is concerned because the Chinese do not always pay or not always pay on time. And the Chinese are viewed as stealing Israeli technology. So Israel is very, very concerned about maintaining its technological edge and about Chinese intelligence operating in Israel. But the relationship at the bilateral economic level, the Chinese has become the first trading partner of Israel, okay, with the European Union, but this is a major trading partner. At the regional level, China does support Israel's enemy, Iran and the Shiite Crescent, and is supporting the Palestinians. It has always supported the Palestinian movement. Communist China was very close to the Palestinian movement. But on the Palestinian track, it is hard to see what China can truly achieve. Maybe a veto resolution at the UN Security Council, but not more for the moment. And regarding the most concerning part is the development of Iran-Chinese relationship. And with this, the difference with Israel, the difference with the Russians is that Russia does have a genuine interest in protecting the security of Israeli civilians because Russia feels as a protector of the Russian-speaking community in Israel. Russia has this big idea of the Russian world And we, Israel, are part of this Russian world. So Russia does have a genuine security interest. China doesn't. China doesn't have this historical and diaspora concern that Russia does. So this is a major concern. You're right. The second question was about Afghanistan. The withdrawing of US forces from Afghanistan is a catastrophe, also for Middle Eastern powers. It means a destabilization of Afghanistan. It means the potential of spillover terrorism in the area. And what we've seen Russian and Iranian efforts to include the Taliban into the future political establishment of Afghanistan, to include the Taliban. And this is a major concern. And I believe that Israel is involved, in the second or third circle of its own security. Israel is involved in some ways because it does represent a major security concern for the Middle East at large, but also for Israel, indirectly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah. So we have one question. It's, I guess you have more or less answered it, but I'll just read the question in case you want to add some points. Yesterday, Israel supported the Canadian government at UNHRC to allow independent observers to visit China's Xinjiang province. How is this going to influence China-Israel cooperation? Is Israel witnessing a policy shift towards China?
I don't know. I don't know if Israel is moving towards a policy shift towards China. I just know that Israel is acting under tremendous amount of pressure, to be aligned with the West, with Canada and other powers on the Xinjiang province question. Israel is also trying to create pressure points against China, counter pressure points, in case of, for example, new deals between China and Iran. Israel needs to establish for itself leverages also that could have influence on China. So I believe that is Israel is trying to do at the moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. Thank you. And to put it on record, China is weakening and harming Israel's two best friends, that is US and India. So certainly there has to be some kind of a global action or global, I would say, action plan against this revisionist power. They are suppressing, they are killing innocent people in Balochistan, in Sindh, everywhere. They're just present with a very Chinese way of threatening the global peace and order. So I guess it's time when the liberal democracies, like Israel, US, and India come together and put a stiff resistance to the ambitions of a revisionist power. Okay? And I guess so we can take two more questions. Alwait, you wanted to ask something, no? Would you like to? After that, we'll have to wrap up today's discussion.
Just very quickly, Abhinav,
Yes.
I'm very happy that you have brought together these three distinguished speakers, like
Thank you.
particularly encapsulating this topic of Russia and Israel, which we hardly in India discuss about. My question, I would have asked one question to Dr. Nibon, but since he's not here, by the way, I recommend his book to all of you. I have just finished reviewing the book, one of the fascinating accounts on Israel's history, particularly how he connects the ancient, history of Israel with the diplomacy of today. Abhinav, my question would be to both the speakers. You partially have answered, Abhinav, you have partially asked one of the questions that I wanted to ask on Russia in the Middle East. That now the question is to Dr. Sarah. Going by the developments in the last, particularly with the advent of the Syrian crisis, there have been lots of discussions about the role of the Russians, coming, full throttle in the Middle East. And do you agree to the fact that Russia will continue to engage with Israel no matter what, despite the relations with the US? In order to be a major player in the Middle East, Russia will have to take into confidence the Israeli, its relations with Israel. So your opinion on that. And the second question would be to my friend Nina. Nina, see, towards the end of Netanyahu's tenure, he exited the office by giving a slight signal that he wasn't very happy with the response of India. And there was a whole lot of a discussion in India about the exclusion of Indian flag from his tweet. That was during the operation of Guardians of the Wall. Is Naftali Bennett going to take on that signal which was given by Netanyahu, or is the new prime minister going to chart altogether a new policy with regard to India? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will very briefly answer your question regarding Russia potentially abandoning Israel. Should the dynamics, evolve in one way or another. For the moment, I doubt it. The first reason for this is that Israel is viewed in Moscow as the Middle East first and foremost military superpower, with strategic capabilities going all over the Middle East. So if there is one actor that Russia doesn't want to mess with in order to pursue its objectives in the Middle East, I would say, very humbly, that for the moment, this is the state of Israel. Second, Russia sees Israel by virtue of its diaspora, Russian-speaking community, but also history as a provider of legitimacy vis-à-vis the West. Why? Because Russia rallies Israel, for example, in its promotion of its heroic narrative of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, or rallies Israel against sanctions, related to Crimea, in order to show the world that Russia does have Western liberal allies tacitly supporting its agenda. So Israel, in a way, is part of Russian soft power or propaganda machine serving to whitewash, its position vis-à-vis the West. Also, there is this deep-seated belief, not only in Russia, but also in Eastern Europe, that Jerusalem or Tel Aviv is the way to Washington. Israel is perceived as a back-channel communication, not only with the White House, but also with the American Congress. So they tend to see Israel as a key communication bridge. So for that matter, they will not try to mess up with Israel because of this leverage. Also, Russia is keenly and deeply interested in Israel's technological know-how. And Russia all the time is asking from Israel to provide, new technological capabilities, new technological training. And this is a knowledge that Russia is very, very thirsty to receive. And the last point is that if you want to pursue a multi-vectorial policy in the Middle East, you need Israel. If you want to balance Iran's aspiration in Syria, you need Israel. If you want to get closer to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, you need Israel. So this is the kind of relationship, this is a purely practical interest-based relationship that, for that matter, they will not renounce. And actually, there was a deep crisis, you remember, in 2018, when a Russian espionage plane was shot down by, the Syrian air defense system, and Russia accused Israel. Crisis lasted, but it ended. And it ended not because Israel, pleaded guilty, but because Russia is deeply interested in this relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah. And with this, we come to the end of our today's wonderful and a fascinating discussion. I'm sure, I got to learn many new things, like most importantly about Russia's back channel and covert rule in Middle East. And I guess we have a lot to learn from this, and likewise, we can only request the Western powers and Americans, to see in a very nuanced way, the role which Russia can play vis-a-vis the emergence of revisionist China. But I'm just getting away from the topic. Today's theme, Israel's foreign policy and diplomacy. Certainly, Israel is a very, very crucial partner, friend, and a great ally to India. Now, it is not just about the government-to-government partnership, but I guess, people of India, we love Israel. You have to see the reaction on the social media. Anything like in the recent Israeli-Hamas standoff, there was a massive outpouring on social media in the favor of Israel. It's some kind of a heart-to-heart connection, and that goes beyond the governments, beyond the politics. And that is something which constitutes the strength, the very robust foundational pillar of Indo-Israel ties. And from here, there's a long way to go ahead and progress in the future. We, both of us, we countries will have multiple existential threats and crises in terms of terrorism, sabotage, cyber espionage. But combined strength, these two countries can work wonders. Okay? Once again, I would like to thank all our eminent panelists today and our advisory board members, Ambassador Trigunayat, C.D. Sahai sir, Krishan Verma sir for joining us today, and His Excellency Shriji Hukum Arvind Singh Ji Mewar for joining us today. It's an honor, and also all our participants and the guests for joining us today. On 28th, we are coming with a new webinar on the religious authorities in West Asia. So please register for that webinar. We'll be uploading the poster and the registration link today itself. And please join us. And I'll also request you that, since we are an NGO, we work mostly on donations and contributions. We try to produce best content. We have a donation page on our website. Okay, so if you feel that, our work is good, if you appreciate our work, please try to support us through your contribution. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you.